On the occasion of the centenary celebration of the birth anniversary of Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav, our department has organized this e-workshop as a beneficial for all students. Our organizer, yes, sir.
There's a lot of disturbance from your side.
Okay, wait, sir.
Please check, is there any device near your mic or something?
So now is it clear? Is it clear, sir, now? Hello.
Yes.
Okay. So can I go again ahead?
Yes, start from the beginning.
Okay, sir. Okay. A wonderful evening to one and all present in this e-workshop. Myself, Esther Prema, host of today's workshop, like to address you all to about a 15-day national level e-workshop on UGC NEET JRF in English. Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, B.N.N.College Bhiwandi. Today, our college has become the center of academic attraction and excellence in the district of Thane with its conventional as well as professional courses. On the occasion of the centenary celebration of birth anniversary of Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav, our department has organized this e-workshop as a beneficial for all students. Our organizer, respected Principal Sir, Dr. Ashok Wang, Head of the Department Chairman, Board of Studies in Mumbai University, Dr. Sudhir Nekam Sir, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Sashikant Bhulenkar Sir, Professor Bimrao Paikrao Sir, and Professor Rajani Rajbao Wagmare Sir. They are the gems of our college. Now, I would like to extend my warm welcome to our patrons with joy and honor. The world is full of diamonds and gems, and we have having some of them here today to build this event. I would like to give my heartiest welcome to our chief guest, Ma'am Vaidahi Haryani Ma'am. At present, she is pursuing her PhD in MKB University. In the year 2019, she has been qualified as assistant professor. Ma'am has also completed her GSET from MS University. She presented her paperwork in international, 10th national, and global conference level, which is organized by various higher departments. She is awarded with second rank in GEC at Sahas Talent Search in 2015. We are really proud of you, ma'am, to have your quality time with us. Now, I would like to hand over this section to Vaidahi Haryani ma'am. Ma'am, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and a very good evening, everyone. So today we are going to discuss something about a unit in your UGC NET syllabus called fiction and short story, and I'm going to deal with the short story. So let me just share my screen and start.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, is the screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Very well, you're audible.
Okay, so we all are fond of listening to different kind of stories, especially when we are talking about students of English literature. We all love to hear stories, whether we are reading it or we are listening it from different people. So all these stories somewhere are very helpful to us in nurturing our life as well. So get ready for this story time, and let us go ahead with this unit called short story. Now, when we are looking at the syllabus, all the other units as well, we find that all the other units somewhere need a lot of time, and the length of the novel or length of the book is quite long. And many a times it happens while preparing for our examination that we don't get much time to read all those things. But this particular unit is very easier in preparation in comparison to other units, that the stories are very short, and you can spare different time for this reading it, and the stories are so interesting that we can remember it quite well. Now, going back to the roots, short story is not something which is new or which is being developed very recently or in the time of literature. If we see, if we go back to the roots, we will find that we all had this, like every culture has this old storytelling tradition. Even in the childhood, even when we grow up, we see that in the childhood, our grandparents do tell us different stories, and that is how we live our childhood. And then we read different magazines. In the cartoons also, we see that different, short stories are being animated. But earlier, it was a oral storytelling tradition before the language was invented. So it's quite a older genre of literature. And older oral narratives were rhymed in different verse, had some certain kind of rhythm that the tales can be sung. Now, if we go back to the Indian culture, we would find that we have the myth called Mahabharata and Ramayana. Now, if we look at it, it's not a short story, of course, it is a kind of an epic poem. But if we look at it, the form of writing is such that it can be rhymed, it can be sung. So in similar way, the stories were in a form of a rhythm, in a form of a different kind of songs which people used to sing back then. The oldest form of short story is anecdote, which was very popular during the Roman Empire. Now, anecdote functioned as a kind of a parable, a kind of a hint, a kind of action being given. And anecdote is a brief, realistic narrative that embodies a point. It tries to convey something, tries to give a kind of a hint of the realistic narrative. So this is a kind of a form which is very oldest. Even before the language was there, the oral storytelling was done before the writing started. Now, another form close to the short story is a fable. And one of the very popular example which we all can relate are the stories of Panchtantra. So fable is a kind of a tale given with a kind of a moral. And usually, like earlier, the characters were animals. Animals used to speak to each other and give a kind of a message to everyone. Now, these ancient fables were introduced by a Greek historian called Herodotus, and it is said that it was invented in 16th century BCE by a Greek slave named Aesop, and it's known as Aesop's Fables. But apart from fable or apart from anecdote, we can also consider the tale, the fairy tales as well in the form of short stories. So somewhere all these stories are connected to our childhood. So short stories is not something which is quite old, quite new. So what is a short story? Now, short story is that one should be able to read it in one sitting. Like it just take a few, let's say, few minutes, maybe half an hour to read any of the story. Long stories that cannot be called novels and they cannot be called short stories are being fit into a term called novella. For example, Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. It is not quite long as we can consider it into a novel. It is not quite short that we can consider it into a short story. So it is considered as a novella, a brief novel. So short story, as we say, is a brief work of prose fiction. Still, there are different elements which define or which help us define short story. So let us see which are they. So first is the length of the short story should be lesser than a novella. So maybe we can take 2 or 3 hours maybe for reading a novella, but it should be less than that. The length of the short story should be lesser than that. Now, in the length of the short story, there are lots of debate going on as well, that how many words should be considered, how many pages should be considered. So we'll not get much into that, because everywhere you will find different criteria. The subject of short stories are usually focus on a single subject or theme. And usually you also see that it focuses on a single character also sometimes. There are different characters in the story, but the protagonist, if we see, is usually an individual. So the subject of theme, now that also ranges from different things. Like for example, there are short stories of everyday life. You will find a short story of a ghost, or a short story of people thinking about their life and giving a kind of a message. So a single and easily contained plot is one of the hallmark of the short story and helps to shape its other characteristics. Short story usually takes place in a single setting and begin into the middle of things. Now, back then, if we look at the fairy tales or the short stories, somewhere when we are given a task to write down, that you have to write a short story, how you are going to begin. And usually we find that we start with once upon a time, and there was this things going on, and once upon a time there was a person like this. So it starts with once upon a time. Now usually we have this just one thing in our mind, but many a times it happens that short stories begin in the into the middle of things. Like for example, it doesn't start with the introduction of the character, that once upon a time there was this particular character, but rather than in the middle of something, you will find that a short story is starting. So the beginning is a bit different, and it is plays in the single setting. For example, anyone is writing, or we are reading a short story about a girl in the room, then the setting of the short story will be the single setting. So in general, short stories tend to begin and end abruptly. So even many of the short stories you read, you will find that the end of the short story is quite weird, or sometimes we are not able to get a kind of a message. Like we saw that fables or a fairy tales or anecdote come up with a kind of a message. Now the short stories do come up with a kind of a message, but that is reading between the lines. So sometimes the end is quite abrupt. So with little to no prior information or no major lapses in time, as they involve just one plot line and are limited in word length. There is a little room or need of extended development we frequently find in novels. Limited number of characters. We don't find so many characters in our short stories. There are very limited characters, and due to limitation of the genre, short story focuses on just one couple of characters. For example, maybe a character, then his friend, or maybe a girl and her parents, or maybe 1 or 2, 3 characters. That's it. So how did this genre develop? Now, before going to this, we see that storytelling tradition, as I told you, belongs to every culture. Now, if we are talking about our country, we move back to, let's say, America, we find that they do have storytelling culture. Then we go back. So storytelling culture is a kind of, loved by all the human beings. So I think there won't be anyone who doesn't like to hear or listen to stories. Now it is not only, limited to the books. We see that we watch movies, we see different short films on YouTube. Now, all that are kind of stories we like to know. So every culture has its development of short stories. So when you are preparing for your examination, we should know this, that every culture, so every literature is having a kind of a development of short story, whether it be Russian literature or we take American literature, British literature, Indian writing in English. So all the literature, you will find that they do have a kind of a development for this particular genre. So in Europe, the oral storytelling tradition began to develop into written stories in the early 14th century. And in early 14th century, we see that this particular tradition, which was in the oral form, started in the written form as well. And it was with Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is a kind of huge in verse, but you find that it does have different kind of tales, which gives a kind of a message. Or it was then, introduced by Decameron by Boccaccio. Now, both of these books are composed of individual short stories with a kind of a narrative story. Now, at the end of 16th century, some of the most popular short stories, which were darkly tragic and called novella, was by a famous writer, especially done in the French translation. In the middle 17th century in France, there was a development of refined short story, and it was called novelty by authors like Madame de Lafayette. Now, here, before moving ahead, I would also suggest that all those aspirants who are with us right now virtually, I would suggest you that you do keep taking notes of this. Of course, you are going to get a certain kind of list, but that particular list you will find in all the books you will read, or maybe if you are surfing on Google, everywhere you will find the list of the writers. But if we are going with this particular flow, with this development of genre, if you are making notes, then it would be very helpful to you in preparing your notes. In 1690s, traditional fairy tales begin to publish. And we know that there was a time when the fairy tales was kind of published and was flowing in a very wonderful way, and everyone can connect with this traditional fairy tales. Now, of course, the time is different, but it plays a very vital role in flourishing this particular genre. So one of the famous collections was by Charles Perrault. Now, the appearance of Anthony Garland's first modern translation of the, let's say, Arabic short story called Arabian Nights. And this was also very popular. We have seen that this particular story's translation then was also went into a movie adaptation, or in kind of an animated movie. We have seen this Arabian Nights. And in 18th century, European short stories of Voltaire and Diderot, pardon the pronunciation. Now, this is the development of genre. Now, before going ahead, I have divided this particular presentation or this particular things which you are going to study into different timelines. So if you are, comfortable with this particular way, you can prepare your notes in this way. If you want to prepare it in a way that first you are going to read or write everything about Russian short stories, then you are writing everything about European short stories, and then in that way also the notes can be prepared. But here I thought that let us go with the different timeline. So it begins with 1790 to 1850. Now let's see which short stories or which writers emerged during this particular timeline. So the first short stories in the United Kingdom, or let's say into British literature, European literature, were Gothic tales, like the remarkable narrative, The Prisoner of Montremos. The greatest novelists like Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens also wrote some short stories. So in British literature, we see that the subject of the theme of short story was Gothic tales. When they started writing it, it was the Gothic tales. In France, the Prosper Mérimée wrote the Falcon in 1829. So here we see that this is the first short story written in France or written in French literature. In Russia, we see that Alexander Pushkin wrote romantic and mysterious tales, including the Blizzard, the Queen of Spades, Nicole Gogai's newest prospect, The Nose, The Overcoat, are some dark, humorous tales about human misery. So here we see that in British, it started with the Gothic tales. When we come down to Russia, we see that it started with dark, humorous tales about human misery. In Germany, the first collection of short stories was by Heinrich von Kleist in 1810 and 11. The Brothers Grimm published their first volume of corrected fairy tales in 1812. E.T.A. Hoffmann followed with his own original fantasy tale, of which The Nutcracker and the Mouse King is the most famous. So everywhere we see that the subject matter is differing a lot. Like somewhere it's starting with ghosts, somewhere it's talking about the fantasy, somewhere it's about imagination. So somewhere we see that short stories are a kind of a reflection of whatever is going in the society. One of the earliest short stories in the United States of America, or let's say American literature, was Charles Brown's Somnambulism. Washington Irving wrote mysterious tales about Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Nathaniel Hawthorne published the first part of his Twice Told Tales in 1837. So here we see that almost everywhere in all the different literature, people had started coming up with certain kind of short stories. Now, all these writers, why they are important? Because they are the one with whom the short story started, writing of short stories started. So many a times we might get questions from this as well, that who was the earliest short story writers of American literature, who was the first story writer of British literature. Edgar Allan Poe. Now, this is a kind of, let's say, favorite short story writer. Even so many questions are asked in the exams about his stories. So Edgar Allan Poe, also known as the father of short stories. So now, right now, when we are looking at this, that the development of short stories started at different places, but short story as a genre became popular by American literature and Russian literature. It was American short stories and Russian short stories which became so popular, and that particular popularity influenced a lot of different writers to come up with this particular genre. So Edgar Allan Poe, his tales of misery and imagination. So he started between 1832 and 1849, and all of his classic stories are The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Pit and the Pendulum. Now, all this particular story, if we see, they do have a kind of a Gothic theme and a kind of a dark part of any particular human being who might be very normal and having a certain kind of psychological issues. So all these things were counted in this particular story. So Edgar Allan Poe why he is known as the father of short story, because he is the one who started with a kind of an experimentation. Because if we go down to the oral tradition and then we start with the beginning of the stories, we find that mostly it is a kind of a story with a moral. Now, even if when we are talking about stories of connected with Indian writing in English, I'm giving this example because we can relate to it much. So if we go down to that, we find that there is a story of either a hero, there is a story of either a fairy or either a girl who is sad and some kind of magic happens, or we see that there are kind of moral stories in which animals are talking to each other, giving a kind of a message, especially to children, about how we have to be, what kind of ideals we can develop. Now, that was a normal subject matter when we find the oral tradition of this storytelling. Now, when we come down to Edgar Allan Poe, rather than just beginning with the same thing, he started a kind of an experiment, and all his stories became so much popular that he is considered as a father of short story. In the first detective story, The Murderers in the Rue Morgue, in the philosophy of composition, in 1846 essay, he has argued that a literary work should be short enough for a reader to finish in one sitting. So again, the characteristic of the short story, if we see that it should be read in one sitting. So this particular characteristic is given by Edgar Allan Poe. So all his works, all his stories are quite important when we are preparing for our examination. And today I'm also going to share a quiz with you at the end. And I have included all the previous year's questions in it. So you will find that there are many questions based on Edgar Allan Poe and his stories. Now we come down to 1850 to 1900. Now let us see what kind of development happened in this particular time. Now in the later 19th century, we see that due to industrialization and the growth of print magazine and journals, now there was a strong demand for strong fiction, short fiction between 3,000 to 15,000 words. And now at that particular time, people had started reading, people had started getting education and started reading as well. And with the growth of print magazines and journals, the short story as a genre flourished a lot. So towards the end of 19th century, all branches of literature and the arts became self-conscious and trying to fit into this particular criteria given by the magazines and journals. Of course, we see that there were many journals. Now, there was a time that there were many magazines and journals coming up with a different series of stories or with different short stories as well. Even in the newspaper, when we read every day, we do see that some newspapers come up with a kind of a column of either the series of stories which is published into the episode, like in this week there is an episode 1, and then for reading more you have to wait till the next. So there was a time when this magazine and journals were quite popular. Now, of course, we are in a different era, and we get short stories in different kind of forms. So people at that time begin to acknowledge that the short story might be shaped according to its own principles. With the rapid industrialization, people got less time to read long piece of literature. They expected to read something interesting in short period and in a single sitting. Now, even I think this is relatable in the present time as well, that everyone is living a kind of a fast life and we don't get time to read or to listen to something for a very long period of time. I think everyone would agree to this, that we don't even like a very longer phone call as well. Or if we have to read something very long, then we might take a kind of a break. And in that particular thing, we get diverted into a different places, different things, different people. And the flow which is there connected to the story certainly breaks. So even at that time, people wanted to read something very short and something very interesting in one single sitting. So this demand was fulfilled by short story, and soon it became a popular genre for literature. So before that, uh, again, if we go to the recap, we find that first it was a time of listening, and then a time came when the short stories were written. And basically, then when we were sharing a kind of a stories or telling a kind of a stories, and people became a kind of a, let's say, self-independent in reading these stories. And then came a time where the life became very fast due to this industrialization, and then it went on and on. So short stories somewhere was a kind of a genre which people were connecting a lot, because the themes, of course it varied a lot, but you find that somewhere the themes are connected with everyday life and people get related to it. So in United Kingdom, in this particular time in 19th century, Thomas Hardy wrote dozens of short stories, including The Three Strangers, A Mere Interlude, Barbara of the House of Cabaret. Now here, if you see Thomas Hardy, mostly we know him as a novelist. Now one more thing I am going to add here is that many a times while preparation, even I'm talking about my own experience, that when we are preparing, when we are making our notes, what do normally we do? That okay, we are talking about any one particular writer, reading it, we just go through some of the famous works, or maybe he is known for one particular genre. So mostly we focus on the main important novels written by Thomas Hardy, and we don't give much attention to the other things he might have written. Now this is a kind of error or a mistake we all do, including me. Even I did when I was doing this particular preparation. So we might know the novels by Thomas Hardy, but when we come to the short stories, we might not have idea of which short stories he has written. So this is the thing. This is the thing we have to develop while making notes, that we have to consider all the works when we are studying one particular writer, whether it is poems, whether it's short stories, novels, everything. Rudyard Kipling, again, a very famous short story writer, and we all might know his one story, which is very popular. Those who are 90s kids, they might know it. And even in today also, they might have heard from someone. So Rudyard Kipling presented a character called Mowgli. So he published short story collections like Plain Tales from the Hills for grown-up, as well as the Jungle Book for children. Now we might not connect much with Plain Tales from the Hills, but we all remember the Jungle Book. So now when we are preparing for these short stories, the stories are very interesting. So many a times while preparation, it might happen that you know how much you are going to read, for how much long you are going to sit, then how you are going to prepare in that particular way. So now if there is something interesting, then we all would enjoy preparation for the examination. I know this, we have this idea that preparation for examination and the pressure for examination, but it can be turned into fun while reading the short stories, because it will give you a kind of a curious interest effect. In 1890, Arthur Conan Doyle brought the detective story to a new height with the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective. So detective genre, or the theme of detective in the short story, was brought by Arthur Conan Doyle in 1892. Again, a very important name. H.G. Wells wrote his first science fiction stories in 1880s. One of his best known is The Country of the Blind. So H.G. Wells, again, we know that this name is connected to the science fiction, a science fiction novel, but science fiction stories are also written by H.G. Wells. Now, in American literature, Herman Melville published his short story collection, The Piazza Tales, in 1856. And the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country was the title of Mark Twain's first book 1 year later, that is in 1866. Now, in the timeline, we are looking at the short stories written at the different places at the same time. Back we studied the stories which were popular in the British literature. Now we are looking at American literature, which were the stories flourishing during this particular time. In 1884, Brander Matthews, the first American professor of dramatic literature, published the Philosophy of the Short Story, which included the idea of the short stories, why it is popular as a genre, what kind of elements do we find in the short stories. At the same year, Matthews was the first one to name the emerging genre called short story. Another theorist of narrative fiction was Henry James, and James a lot of short stories himself, including The Real Thing, The Beast of the Jungle, and etc. And in 1890s, Cat Chopping published first story in the several magazines. So here we can see that first the writers of short stories were limited, maybe due to less development of industry, or maybe the magazines or things are not there that much convenient that people can write it. So during this particular time, there was a kind of a space where there were magazines, there were newspaper flourishing, journalism was going very well at that particular time, and it gave opportunity to many of the writers who were associated with short stories, or the writers who wanted to give the society something by writing. So somewhere we find that magazines and newspapers gave a kind of an opportunity to many young writers at that particular time. In Russia, Ivan Turgenev gained recognition with his short story collection, A Sportsman's Sketches. Now, Russian and American short stories, as I have told earlier, that were made short story genre very popular. While it was going on at all the different places, but the short stories written by them influenced a lot of different writers, a lot of different cultures also. Nikolai Lesko created his first short stories in 1860s. Now, all these names are very important when we are making our notes. Now, later in his life, Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote The Meek One, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, two short stories with a great psychological and philosophical depth. Now, as I told you that it was Edgar Allan Poe who came up with the psychological effect of characters in a short story, and in a very brief way to portray a character and to show that a kind of psychological depth of the character in such brief length is quite challenging. Now, if we think that having a short story, we will be able to portray a character who is having a philosophical depth, how we are going to portray it. So Edgar Allan Poe, why he is known as the father of short story? Because of all these different characteristics he has. So next we see that in Russia also there is a writer who started with the same genre with great psychological and philosophical depth. Leo Tolstoy handled ethical questions in the short stories. For example, in Ivan the Fool, how much land does a man need? Aloysia the Plot. So Leo Tolstoy again came up with a kind of different ethical questions. The greatest specialist of Russian short story, however, was Anton Chekhov. And Anton Chekhov is a very famous short story writer. And while preparing for the exams, we should know about him. We should know about his stories. We should read his stories. for the preparation. Again, a very important short story writer. All are important, but normally if we look at the questions asked in the previous year's exams, some of the names are very popular and are asked frequently. One of them is Edgar Allan Poe. Next is Anton Chekhov. Maxim Gorky's best short story is 26 Men and a Girl, written in 1899. Now, these are some of the names of the stories. It doesn't mean that we just read or refer or only these stories which are given here, but these are the stories which were quite popular at that particular time. Now we come down to 1900 to 1945. Now I have not included Indian English writers here, which I'm going to do after this. So right now we are just looking at the literature other than India. So in United Kingdom, periodicals like the Strand magazine, the Sketch, Harper's Magazine, and the Storyteller contributed to the popularity of the short story. Now, before this, we have seen that first it started in America, that people began writing in the magazine. Now we are coming down to United Kingdom in 1900 to 1945. All these different periodicals were flourishing, and all that helped in contributing the popularity of the short story. So Hector Hugh Munro, also known by his pen name of Saki, wrote satirical short stories about Edwardian England. So again, we are seeing that the theme of the short story is changing here. Till now, we have seen psychological things, we have seen different kind of satire. Now here we are seeing that writing a satirical short story. So slowly, all the different themes kept on changing according to the time and circumstances the society was facing. Somerset, who wrote over 100 short stories, was one of the popular author of his time. Again, a very popular name, and many different questions are asked about his stories as well. P.G. Wodehouse published his first collection of comical stories about Butler Jeeves in 1917. Lot of detective stories were written by Agatha Christie, Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers, and short stories by Virginia Woolf, that is Kew Gardens and Solid Objects, are about a politician with mental problems. And when we look at the writing style of Virginia Woolf and the things she has written, we find out that she writes things including the mental problems a lot, and it's kind of getting relatable to the people at that particular time. So these two particular short stories. Now Virginia Woolf also, we know she's very popular novelist. We might know different novels of her, but we hardly know about her short stories. So all these names are very important. These stories are very important. Graham Greene wrote his 21 stories between 1929 and 1954. A specialist of the short story was Pritchett, whose first collection appeared in 1932. Arthur Clarke, again important name, published his first science fiction story, Travel by Wire, in 1937. So everywhere we see that the themes of short stories keep on changing. Somewhere we find that it started in a very moral way. Somewhere we see that it starts with giving a message. Somewhere we see that there is a kind of a satire written. Somewhere we see that a dark, tragic theme is being included. Now, all this, depending on the situations at that time, all this is kindly captured in all these different short stories. Now, the periodicals, the development of newspaper magazines, the short stories, it became kind of popular because it became favorite of the common people. Now, it is not that everyone started reading initially, but initially when people started learning how to read, started getting educated, short story might be working in that particular way, that it is short in length and people will able to read it within few time and understand it. And that is why it became quite popular, because it was published in magazines, newspapers, which is a kind of a everyday reading in all the homes, almost all the homes. And in, like, for example, today, if we see, we know so many columnists due to the newspapers. Now, the columnist might have written different books, might have written different stories and published a book, but we know the columnist because we are reading the newspaper daily. So in that particular way, short story at that time became quite popular. So in the first half of 20th century, a number of high-profile American magazines such as the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, the Saturday Evening, so all these different periodicals published short stories in each issue. The demand for quality of short stories was so great that the money paid for it was so well that Fitzgerald repeatedly turned to short story writing to pay his numerous debts. And because it became very popular and people were enjoying it a lot, a good amount of money was paid to the one who wrote a short story. Now, his first collection, Fitzgerald's first collection, was The Flappers and Philosophers, appeared in a book form in 1920. William Faulkner wrote over 100 short stories. For example, Go Down Mosses, a collection of 7 stories. All are these popular stories of his, appeared in 1941. Ernest Hemingway. Now, although we know him as a novella writer, the famous Old Man and the Sea, he started concise writing style, shorter than a fiction. So he started with the short stories like A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, Hills Like White Elephants, and Dorothy Parker's bittersweet story, Big Blonde, So the Light, in 1929. A popular science fiction, Nightfall, by Isaac Asimov. Now we see that the themes have going differently and are getting popular in a different way. Catherine Mansfield from New Zealand wrote many of her short stories between 1912 and her death in 1923. The Doll's House, 1922, treats the topic of social inequity, how a woman is facing. So now if we are looking at the theme, we find that it is quite new, it is changing. Earlier when we saw, we didn't see many women short story writers getting popular initially. So it was in after 19th century or in the end of 19th century, we see that women writers from the different country are also coming up with a kind of a message for the society. 2 important authors of short stories in German language were Thomas Mann and Franz Kafka. In 1922, the latter wrote Hunger of Artists, about a man who fasts for several days. Now here we see that in German language, the theme has started up with the characteristics of the artist, how a creative person faces certain kind of things, and how they are portraying into a short story. Now, here is a person, pardon the pronunciation, I'm not sure about it. Now, this is called, he is called the father of Japanese short story. So here we can see that almost everywhere the genre as a short story started developing in different ways. Now, after 1945, the post-war era, what kind of themes started coming into the short story after this war era? So the period following World War II saw a great flowering of literary short story fiction in United States. So the New Yorker, a magazine, continued to publish the works of firm's leading mid-century practitioners, including Shirley Jackson, who wrote a short story called The Lottery, published in 1948. elicited the strongest response in magazine's history at that particular time. Now, after World War II, almost all the short stories came up with a kind of a theme of people having after war effect, and then what kind of things they are facing. Other frequent contributors during the last 1940s included John Cheever, John Steinbeck, Jean Stafford. Now, all this came up with a different kind of short stories. Selinger's 9 stories experimented with the point of view and voice. Now, before that experiment were done in the short story genre in a different way. But after post-war era, we see that it also came up with a point of view and a voice. Now, before that, there was a kind of a story with a very simple message, a kind of a simple story we are telling to someone, which doesn't have much experimentative thing. But Selinger's stories came up with a point of view and a voice. So people started using this particular genre for raising a voice, or giving a kind of a warning, or spreading a kind of awareness in the society. Now, Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is hard to find. Now, it talk about the Southern Gothic style. So again, one particular writer which went maybe influenced by Edgar Allan Poe and went away with this Gothic style of writing. When Life magazines published Ernest Hemingway's long short story, or we can say novella, The Old Man and the Sea, in 1952, the issue containing this story was sold in, lots of copies were sold in just 2 days. So this became a very popular genre by them, that as well. And The Old Man and the Sea, we see that it is a very interesting novella. It can be completed in a very short time, and also being adapted into a movie. And it is found in the syllabus in many universities. So this particular novella again was a kind of initiative for this particular genre called novella. So if we are looking at the development of novel, then we can consider it that how it flowed, like short story, then came novella, and then we go down to novel, which is a bit longer. Bill Roth and Grace Pell cultivated distinguished Jewish American voices. Now, at first, when we look at the American literature, we find that, okay, the citizens, or we are finding voices from people in America writing in the literature. Then comes a time where we see a different kind of voices, like Jewish American voices, African American voices, a kind of a mixed culture and kind of feelings, or kind of things people are facing everywhere, coming down into the same literature. Olsen's I Standing Here Ironing adopted a consciously feminist perspective. Now, this is also something new, that people had started writing stories with different perspective. Back then, it was not the case that there is a perspective and people are writing accordingly. It was just a kind of a normal tale with a kind of a moral message. James Baldwin's Going to Meet the Men told stories of African American life. Now, at this particular time, we see a lot of themes based on migrations, or based on people who are moving down to different land, and what kind of things they might be facing when they are migrating, or they are going to different place, what kind of things they are facing, and either they are going there willingly, or a kind of colonies are established and people are caged over there. So all these feelings came down in form of stories. In 1970s, saw the rise of postmodern short story in the work of Donald Barthelme and John Barth. The same decade witnessed the establishment of Pushcart Press under the leadership of Bill Henderson, begin publishing the best of the independent and small presses. Now, after this, we see that a different kind of printing press has also begun, and it gives a kind of more opportunities for publishing the short stories. Stephen King, again one of the best-selling novelists of all that time, initiated his career at that particular time by writing a short story. So minimalism gained widespread influence in 1980s and most notably in the works of Raymond Carver and B.T. Bobby and Mason. However, the traditionalists, including the John Updike, Joyce Oates, maintained significant influence on the form, as did the Canadian author Alice Munro. John Gardner's seminal reference text, The Art of Fiction, appeared in 1983. Now, to write something using very minimum words is quite challenging when we look at this particular genre. Writing a short story maybe is we cannot consider it as a quite easier task, because you have to say a lot of things, or you have to give a kind of a message in very few words, and convince all the readers as well that they can connect with this particular form. So all these writers started with a very good experiment and did a wonderful work. Many of the American short stories of 1990s featured magical realism. Among the leading practitioners of this style were Stephen Milhauser and Robert Allen Butler. Now, all came up with again a new theme about magical realism. So the imagination of the theme has kept on changing a lot. Stuart Dybek gained prominence for his depictions in his Life of Chicago's polished neighborhoods, and Timur Brains, the things they carried, tackled the legacy of Vietnam War. So now we are seeing that after war stories started capturing all the things happened after it. What was the after effect of particular war? And we see that there were different genres capturing this after effect of war everywhere. When we are talking about war, we just don't focus on World War I and World War II. We see that whichever the war happened at that particular time, somewhere were captured in short stories as well. Of course, we know that it was captured in novels, it is captured in poems as well. We have a genre called war poetry. But this war poetry or war novels we do see, but this effect of after war was also captured in the short stories. Louis Edric wrote about the Native American life. David Foster and T.C. Boyle explored the psychology of popular culture or popular literature, you can say, at that particular time. So this American life, this idea of American life again was kept on changing a lot because of the diversity of people living there. So this was something, let's say the initial stage, or let's say development of short stories in different culture, in different literature. India, we have not included in it. So now we are going to see the development of short stories in India. So Indian English short stories. Now Indian English literature has created its own place in the 20th century literature. Like contribution of short story writers is very important when we are talking about Indian English literature. Now, if we are going back to, let's say, the history of Indian English short stories, we see that most of these stories are immersed or has its roots in the Sanskrit language. And we have quite a rich and prosperous tradition of stories. And we see that every time these stories we have got from the, let's say, the myth, Rama and Mahabharata. Now, all these stories from Panch Tantra, or we are looking at the stories from Hitopdesh, Katha Sarita Sagar. Now, all these stories are a major influence of this genre short story in Indian writing in English. And we see that all these stories are in the one way or the other are portrayed in all the writings being done after that. So everywhere we see a bit of influence coming from the roots we have or the tradition of stories we have, and then people have experimented in it a lot. So in the great epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, there are various stories, and we see that these different stories are captured in one way or the other, in one form of the or the other. Even in the postmodern era of short stories in Indian writing in English, we see that a lot of experiments is done. But somewhere the influence we have got from the stories are our ancient culture or our ancient tradition. So Ravindranath Tagore, a very famous short story writer, wrote his first story called Bhikharini or the Beggar Women when he was 16 years old. So somewhere when we are looking at the tradition of India, every child is grown with a kind of different stories, either from the elders or we see the stories people are telling a child around. So all the human beings are certainly grown up listening to different kind of stories, and we being having a prosperous tradition of stories, we see a lot of stories being there around us when we are growing up. So Ravindranath Tagore, at the age of 16 years old, wrote his first short story, and he was the first person who invented Bengali language short story genre. So from 1891 to 1895, known as the Tagore's Sadhana period. Now, this particular period is known as Tagore's Sadhana period. He wrote the 3-volume Galpagucha, which contains 84 stories. And we see that all these Bengali stories are also translated into English. And recently, I think it's not much of time that there is a channel on television called Epic Channel, which had this adaptation of different stories by Ravindranath Tagore, in case you have watched. So now the short stories were adapted in the kind of a movie or kind of a serial as well. The credit of the first Indian English short story. Now, though we have a kind of rich tradition and we go back to the roots, we do have so many stories before it was written or before it was written into, let's say, English language. But the credit for the first Indian English short story collection goes to Kamla Satyanathan's Stories from Indian Christian Life, published in 1898. So before that, short story does existed, but people started to know this as a genre in India with Kamla's stories. At the beginning of 20th century, there are published four short stories by Cornelia Sorabji. Now that was about love and life behind the parda, sun baby studying in the child life of India, between the twilights, being studied of Indian women by one of themselves, and Indian tales of the great ones among men, women, and bird people. Now Sorabji, it is considered, like many of the writers, many of the critics, historians do consider Sorabji as the first women Indian English story writer, though we don't find it, much in the history that it is. Like, for example, this first Indian short story collection is written by this particular person called Kamla, is already there. It is written. Now here, some considered it as a first women Indian English writer, some does not consider. So we cannot just go with the kind of an assumption here. S.S. Bose, S.M. Shastri Banerjee, Prabhat Chandra Mukherjee, Shobana Devi, Dwijendranath Neogi, Madhvi, and Sunti Devi, now are some of the other short story writers of this particular era, of this 19th century. In the late 1980s and early 1930s, short stories are concerned more with moral and social issues. Now, before this, we have seen that it had just started with the beginning of considering the social issues, because people here then started connecting with the short stories, came up with different kind of ideas about Christian life in India, then came about what kind of things women are facing. So Shankar Ram's children of Kaveri and Creature All, R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao and Mulk Raj Anand are prominent short story writers of the mid-30s, again capturing the different Anglo-Indian themes we see in India at that particular time. So Mulk Raj Anand deals with the critical and unpleasant situation of lower classes, hypocrisy of the society. Now all those things were already there with the people, but people didn't had a kind of platform where all these issues, all these problems can be discussed. We don't find that they were having a kind of a way where they could discuss everyday problems. Now Mulk Raj Anand came up with this unpleasant situation of lower classes which were already there. If we go back, we already had this kind of a social structure at that particular time, which created a kind of an unpleasant situation, that but it was not captured into the literature until the writers started capturing it in the form of short stories, in the form of novels. So the examples of his short stories are The Liar, The Lost Child, Woods, Lajwanti, The Tector, and The Corn Goddess. And there are many such other stories also by Mulk Raj Anand, but this of the some stories are quite important. R.K. Narayan's short story. R.K. Narayan short story, I think we all have studied in our school as well. R.K. Narayan, we see that he is writing a very humorous and satiric stories on the society, looking at the everyday life of one particular person. Like for example, Swami and Friends. What kind of situation a boy called Swami is facing when he is going to school, or what kind of things happening with him and his friends, a kind of a childhood things. But in that stories also we find a kind of a humor, but it is a satire on the society. The next is An Astrologer's Day, A Horse and Two Goats, this snake song, Lovely Road. Raja Rao again is a very famous for social and moral realism, political and metaphysical overtones, and fantastic realism. The examples of his stories are Akaya, Javni, A Client, and Narsiga, The Cow of Barricades. T.L. Netson, A.S.P. Iyer, Venkataramani are some prominent contributors of short story during that particular age. But mostly when we are looking at the questions being asked, then we see that Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao's questions are asked a lot. So the short story writers of independent India. Now, before independence, all this were the themes of short stories. Now we see that even before the independence of India, people had started getting awareness about what is right, what is wrong, what kind of treatment human beings are giving to each other, considering the different kind of caste, different kind of religion. Now people were started getting awareness of that okay, something is going wrong. So the short story writers of independent India wrote on the issues like partition, struggle for freedom, political events, question of women, change in social values and their effect on the society. Khushwant Singh is one of the best examples. He is a writer of New India, The Mark of Vishnu, The Voice of God, Karma, The Bride for the Sahib are some of his famous short stories. And when we look at the short stories written in the independent India, we find that how people also had to suffer due to partition, had to leave their home. Many of them were killed, and all those effects are very well captured in Khushwant Singh's stories. Change attitude towards love, breakdown of moral and social values, man-women relationship, free discussion of sex, marriage system, women's search for self-identity were relevant themes popular in 1950s and 1960s. And this particular time, we see that women are also getting a kind of a voice and are getting aware that they are in a kind of a suffering situation. And all this kind of things which were considered as moral, or maybe a certain kind of rules in which a woman was bound at that particular time. In 1950s and 1960s, we see that they have started questioning all those things. And if we move from 1950s to the present time, we see that this questioning or this, challenging kind of rules established by the authorities are being questioned by then. So 1950, 1960s, we can consider a time where women started raising their voice through different stories. Manohar Amalgavkar, Arun Joshi, Ruskin Bond. Ruskin Bond, again, very famous Anglo-Indian short story writer. And we see that many of his story, captures this India at that particular time. Babani Bhattacharya, Chaman Nahal, Manoj Das are some notable names during this particular area. So certainly the new writers of New India. Some notable women short story writers. Now, as we see that during this particular time, the question or the awareness in the women were much, and people were questioning, especially women were questioning the so-called so-called rules being put on them, or being kind of being compulsion to do something or the other. So this notable short story writers like Ishmat Chugtai, Mahasweta Devi, Kamla Das, Shashi Deshpande, Anita Desai, Urmila Pawar, and Jhumpa Lahiri. And there are many women writers who came up with this particular idea and then started questioning. Many of the short story writers among this had to face a different kind of traumas, or different kind of mistreatment was given to them because of the questioning the authority or questioning the society. Among them, we see that I think recently there was a movie being made about Ishmat Chugtai, and then what kind of struggle she had faced while writing the things about women, or challenging the authorities, challenging the society. Vijay Tendulkar, Iravati Karve, Purushottam Lakshman Deshpande, Shivji Sawant are some of the iconic names of Marathi short story writers being translated into English. Some of them have written into English. Among all these notable writers, Vijay Tendulkar is again one of the popular, of course, but it is asked, his questions are asked a lot in the exams as well. So now, these are the different short story writers in American literature. We see it into English literature or British literature. We look at the names in the Indian writing in English. Now, all came up with a different time, came up with different theme. So while preparing the notes, I would suggest that if you go to the timeline and read about the history of writers, or read about the themes the writers are including in their short stories, then you might, you might be able to remember it in quite easy way, or rather than remember, you can understand that what was the situation at that particular time. For example, when we are looking at the stories written after 1950s or after 1920s, then we can look at the theme of independent India. Now, independent India, of course, we had got freedom after so long time but still we see that there were certain kind of struggles. Partition happened, people were facing a lot of different things. So if we read in that particular timeline, then we can understand that why this particular story written by, let's say, for example, Ishmat Chugtai is written in this particular way. What kind of things she is trying to capture in the story are the effects of, let's say, independent India. Now here I'm going to share with you the Cambridge introduction to a short story in English, like British and other literature. Sir, do we have more time?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. So here I'm going to give you a list of important short story writers of British literature and other literature as well. Now the names, some of the names we have already discussed earlier also, but this list will also again help you to identify the century, identify the timeline. Like for example, in the 19th century, if we are looking, these are some famous names called Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Conrad, the Yellow Book Circle, and 1819's Avant-Garde. Now, all these writers or all these forms, we can see the short stories about them. We have to look at it. We have to first read about the themes which they are including in their writing. We should know about the characters of their stories. We should read, at least we should go through the important stories being given by them. And all, many a times I think when we are preparing, we might feel that okay, in 2017 a certain a story was asked. In 2016, if we are going to previous year's question paper, we see that okay, Rudyard Kipling's questions was asked, so let us go for it. Because many a times when we refer to previous year's question, we keep it that things in mind that okay, these are the stories can be asked, and then we might skip any one of them. So I don't think that is a good idea when we are preparing for our examination. Though as in the introduction as said that I've cracked GSET, but I'm still working for my NET exam as well. So many a times while preparing, we do this. So it is better that we go to all these stories. Like for example, we are reading or preparing Charles Dickens, then we should read all these stories by him. Next is the modernist short story writers. And these are the four names. Of course, there are more other short story writers as well, but this particular list are given in the Cambridge Introduction to Short Story in English for British literature and others. So this is also one of the important book which will help you in preparation for the exam. And you will find that the PDF of this particular book is available on Google. So it is easily downloadable, and then you can just refer to this book for your preparation. Next is the postmodernism short story writers: Frank O'Connor, Sion O'Fallon, pardon my pronunciation, Elizabeth Bowen, and V.S. Pritchett, Angela Carter, and Ian McEwan. Now, these are some postmodern short story writers which we should know. Next is post-colonial and other stories. Now we see that short stories also came up with a kind of a different voice. When we are looking at this post-colonial term, we see that how the suppressed also had started coming up with a voice. So Frank Sargeson, Marjorie Bernard, James Kalman, Chinua Achebe, Alice Munro are the other different short story writers. Next, we are going to see the list of American short story writers. Again, this is given in the book, The Cambridge Introduction to American Short Story. Now, as we have seen that American literature and Russian literature made these stories very popular, and we should know all the writers from the American short story as well. So here we see that a lot of names are given. So all these are very important short story writers, which we all should study for our examination, and especially Edgar Allan Poe. All these stories we should know, and all the other writers we have to read. Again, this particular book is also available in PDF form, and very easily you can download it. So again, this is also a worthwhile reading book, especially when you are preparing for examinations. Now here I'm also going to share with you another books which you can refer to. And many a times the aspirants come and ask me that, which books we should read, which books, which books are important. Now, when we are preparing for UGC NET or SET exam, we find that almost everything becomes important. We also see that many a times we read a lot, we refer to a lot of books, and when we go for the examination, there are always some questions we feel that we are reading it for the first time. So I think it might be happening with many of you who are appearing for the competitive exams, that you might have read everything, you might have prepared very well, you are going for the examination, and then you are finding that, oh my God, this is the question I'm reading for the first time, or these are the names I have not referred to. So when everyone asks me that what kind of schedule we should have or what kind of things we should read, then usually I do tell everyone that preparation is kind of, how you are passionate about your examination, how well you want to be in it. So it all depends on, I will say, on you, rather than on books, rather than on the material available given by your teachers. So you have to create a kind of a magic for your own madness. And that is what I say, that you should have a kind of a method or a kind of a magic to your own madness. So which method is preferable to you? It is going to be different from for every individual. Like, for example, some might not be able to, remember or understand things by reading. For you, it might be that the audio visual works very well. So if you are free, you are referring to any video on YouTube, then you will connect to that and you will easily understand, you will easily remember things from a video rather than a book. So it's totally depending on you that how, you are going to prepare. Another thing I would share about my own experience was that when I was preparing for the examination, I was working at the department as a visiting faculty. I was also a research scholar here, so I was studying for my PhD. And in between, I was preparing for my NET and SET exam. So for me, this have worked in a very different way. So it depends. Some of you might be reading for 8 hours and might be cracking the exam. Some of you, like me, who are already working, you are already in the multiple things you are doing together, then you might connect, or you might get remembrance well with the YouTube videos. So in my case, whenever I was sparing some time, it's not that you are working anywhere, you are having multiple things apart from studying, you are having certain personal things. So in that also, we have to spare at least some time that we refer to any videos. So in the YouTube also, you will find that there are many interesting videos which will helpful to you for your preparation of exams. So it's not necessary that you just go with the books. That is what has helped me in this particular case, that I have not referred only to books, but rather than discussion also helps you a lot. So in case you are preparing with your friend, then you can discuss things with them, and that is also a easier way that you can grasp the things very well. And these are the things we cannot cram. Like, for example, if we are going to cram something, how you are going to cram all the books? There are so many books according to the different units. How you are going to? So it's better that you understand the story, better you understand the things, how it is being said, and then you can remember it very easily. And now this can be happen when you are doing discussion or you are doing a kind of a revision for someone else. Like for example, many of us will be related to it. Like for example, we are having an examination tomorrow and a friend is coming and telling us that what is the story of this particular book. And while telling that particular person, we might remember the story very well because we are explaining it to someone else. Discussion with your classmates, with your friends, and that will help you a lot in remembering things. So I would at last just suggest every one of you that create your own method to your madness. So in case like in today's session, still there are many things which we are not able to discuss due to time limit. All these stories we cannot discuss in one particular session as well. So all these stories are very interesting. All these stories come up with very different themes, and definitely for preparing for your examination, this particular unit will help you to create a kind of interest in studying. So in case you need any of the help, then you can contact me. I'm going to share this presentation which I have shared here. So I'll share that link soon. And I have given a quiz link, so which will be, I think, pasted in the chat box. So I would request everyone that go for this. It is a kind of a practice quiz, and this is just the first initial quiz I have given. So I have made 2 more quiz which I'll share with sir or like very soon, and then you will be able to practice that also. So once again, I would say that go for it. Yes, don't give up even if you are not getting clearance at the first try. I think we should just go and see that every try will give you something new, will tell you that what is the thing you are lacking, what are the efforts you need to give once again. So don't just give up in the preparation, but just go for it. And every time go for it. I would say that even if you are not clearing it, then you just go for it. Don't just let the exam go, become a kind of a stubborn person and go for it. So these are the works cited. And before ending, once again, I would like to thank Dr. Sudhir Nikam sir for this particular session. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Jivamani.
Yes, sir, I'm here. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for spending your valuable time with us. It was much interesting, and your experience also was very much interesting. This section has made us to grow and prepare for our future. From it was just a topic short story, but you took us to all the countries, from listening how to write this story, the character of the story, the differentiation between the length of the story and the about this short story and the long story, development of the genre. It was very much interesting to listen, and you have also given us many much references of the book and how the translation took place and how the European stories, Germany, Europe stories were there. And today we also came to know he is the father of the short story, Edgar Allan Poe. It was much an interesting time to spend with you. Now I would like to admit my thoughts. A good event never ends in the world. And am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. A good event never ends in the world. They take only a pause and keep us awaiting for the next. Yes, on Monday we will join you with another speaker, Mrunal Raj Vivek Mohite, with a new topic, literary criticism. And I will pass this section to Prasanna John for the host. Thank you all. God bless you all. Have a great night. Now you all can wind up this meeting.